The artillery crater stretched beyond the horizon like a wound in the earth's flesh, carved by the great siege cannons of the Iron Sultanate 3 winters past. What had once been the blessed township of Cathara now yawned as a pit of blackened stone and twisted metal, its diameter spanning 7 miles of cursed ground. The crater walls rose in terraced rings, each level carved with the remnants of streets and buildings that had been sheared away by the bombardment, leaving behind a spiral city of exposed foundations and broken sanctuaries. But it was not the size of the crater that drew pilgrims and penitents from across the war-torn lands. It was the candles. Thousands upon thousands of green flames flickered in the crater's depths, each one burning without wax or oil, their light casting sickly shadows across the rubble-strewn terraces. The flames rose from what appeared to be ordinary candle stubs, but closer inspection revealed the horrifying truth that had made Cathara a site of pilgrimage and terror in equal measure. Each wick was a human spinal cord, still pink with life, still pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat that had no heart to sustain it. The vertebrae glowed translucent in the green fire, and when the wind was still, observers claimed they could hear whispers rising from each flame, prayers and screams intermingled in languages both familiar and utterly alien. Chaplain Exorcist Maeve of the New Syncretic Orthodox knelt at the crater's eastern rim, her gauntleted hands pressed against the carved bone rosary that hung from her neck. The beads were cut from the finger bones of martyred saints, each one blessed in the blood of the righteous and inscribed with verses from the True Testament. She had carried this rosary through 7 years of trench warfare, 7 years of blessing bolt-action rifles and performing last rites over soldiers whose bodies had been torn apart by heretic artillery. But she had never faced a task like the one that awaited her in the crater below. The green light played across her weathered face, highlighting the scars that crisscrossed her cheeks and forehead. Each mark told a story of battles fought against the servants of the adversary, of exorcisms performed in muddy shell holes while machine gun fire rattled overhead. Her hair had gone white during the siege of New Antioch, when she had spent 3 days straight casting out demons from a regiment of trench pilgrims who had been possessed by the whispers of corrupted liturgies. Now it hung in matted braids beneath her steel helm, woven through with strips of blessed parchment that bore the names of the dead she had failed to save. Behind her, the 12 members of her chosen squad made their final preparations for the descent. Each warrior bore the marks of their calling, their armor inscribed with holy verses and their weapons blessed with oils pressed from the olive trees that grew in the courtyards of the sacred seminary. They were volunteers all, men and women who had looked upon the horror of the crater and chosen to descend into its depths rather than let the souls trapped within continue their eternal torment. Brother Sergeant Khalil checked the blessed ammunition in his Enfield rifle, each bullet carved with microscopic prayers and dipped in holy water that had been sanctified in the catacombs beneath Jerusalem. His dark skin bore the ritual scarification of a desert monastery, patterns of raised flesh that formed the sigils of binding and protection. He had served as Maeve's second-in-command for 3 years, ever since the Battle of the Bleeding Ossuary, where together they had banished a host of shadow wraiths that had been feeding on the bone marrow of buried saints. Sister Agatha tested the edge of her ceremonial blade, a curved sword forged from metal taken from the nails of the true cross. The blade hummed with contained power, its surface etched with verses that glowed faintly in the presence of unholy things. She was young for an exorcist, barely 25, but her faith burned with the intensity of molten iron. During the winter offensive at Golgotha Ridge, she had walked unarmed through a barrage of heretic artillery, her prayers turning aside shells that should have obliterated her utterly. The others bore similar marks of their devotion. Brother Marcus, with his collection of blessed grenades, each one filled with powdered bone from martyred bishops. Sister Helena with her medical kit, the bandages soaked in oils that could heal both flesh and spirit. Brother Pavel with his heavy machine gun, its barrel inscribed with the names of every demon he had sent back to the pit. Each member of the squad had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return, knowing that the crater held horrors that could shatter both body and soul. Maeve rose from her knees and turned to address her warriors. The green light from below cast her shadow long across the rocky ground, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one who had stood before the gates of hell itself and demanded entry in the name of the righteous. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her words cutting through the cold night air like a blade through silk. "What lies below us is an abomination that must not be allowed to endure. The souls of the faithful burn in those unholy flames, their agony feeding the power of our enemies. Every night that passes, their suffering grows deeper, their cries more desperate." She gestured toward the crater, where the green flames danced and flickered like a sea of malevolent stars. "The Iron Sultanate sought to break our spirits by destroying Cathara, but in their hubris they have created something far worse. The bombardment shattered not just buildings and bodies, but the very boundary between the living and the dead. Now the souls of those who perished are trapped in a state between life and death, their spinal cords serving as wicks for flames that burn with the power of the damned." Brother Khalil stepped forward, his scarred face grim with determination. "What is our objective, chaplain? Do we seek to extinguish every flame?" Maeve nodded slowly. "Intelligence gathered by our scouts suggests that there is a pattern to the flames, a central nexus from which all the others draw their power. If we can reach the heart of the crater and extinguish the master candle, the others should follow. But the path will not be easy. The crater is defended not just by the flames themselves, but by the shadows they cast." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the squad. "Each time a flame is extinguished, it births a shadow duplicate of the one who snuffed it out. These shadows are not mere phantoms, but perfect copies possessed of all the original's memories, skills, and malice. They will hunt us through the crater's depths, seeking to prevent us from reaching our goal." Sister Agatha frowned, her hand tightening on the hilt of her blessed blade. "How do we distinguish between the real and the false?" "We don't," Maeve replied grimly. "That is the true horror of this place. By the time we reach the center, we may be outnumbered by our own duplicates, unable to trust even our closest comrades. But we must press on regardless, for the alternative is to abandon thousands of souls to eternal torment." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of burning bone and something else, something sweet and cloying that made the warriors' stomachs turn. From the crater below came the sound of whispers, thousands of voices speaking in unison, their words lost in the distance but their desperation unmistakable. Maeve raised her hand, and the squad fell silent. "We descend at midnight, when the flames burn lowest. Brother Khalil will take point with myself, while Sister Agatha guards our rear. The rest of you will form a protective circle around Sister Helena and our supplies. Remember, once we enter the crater, there can be no retreat. The shadows will cut off our escape route, forcing us ever deeper toward the center." She looked each of her warriors in the eye, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. "If any of you wish to withdraw, do so now with no shame. What awaits us below is unlike anything we have faced before." None moved. Each had made their peace with death long ago, and each understood that some battles must be fought regardless of the cost. As the hours passed toward midnight, the squad made their final preparations. They checked their weapons and equipment, recited the prayers of warding, and consumed the blessed wafers that would protect their souls from corruption during the descent. The green light from the crater seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats, as if the flames themselves were aware of the approaching threat. Maeve stood apart from the others, her eyes fixed on the depths below. In her mind, she could hear the voices of the trapped souls, their pleas for release growing more urgent as midnight approached. She had dedicated her life to serving the faithful, to protecting the innocent from the horrors that spawned in the trenches and shell holes of this endless war. But she had never faced a task that required such sacrifice, such absolute commitment to duty over self-preservation. The crater waited, its green flames dancing like demons in the darkness, and somewhere in its depths, at the very center of the spiral city, burned the master candle that held all the others in thrall. To reach it, Maeve and her squad would have to navigate 7 miles of cursed ground, fighting not only the shadows that would spawn from every extinguished flame, but eventually their own duplicated selves. As the clock tower of a distant monastery chimed the approach of midnight, Maeve offered a final prayer to the saints who had gone before her. Then she turned to her squad and gave the signal to begin their descent into the crater city of the damned. The first terrace of the crater was carved from what had once been the merchant quarter of Cathara, its shops and warehouses reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal and crumbling stone. The green flames clustered thickest here, growing from the remains of market stalls and counting houses like poisonous mushrooms after rain. Each flame cast its own pool of sickly light, and in that illumination the squad could see the true extent of the horror they faced. The spinal cords that served as wicks were not simply bone, but living tissue that pulsed and twitched as the flames consumed them. Some still bore traces of flesh and nerve, raw pink sinew that glistened in the green light. Others had been burned down to pure white bone, their vertebrae fused into twisted spirals by the heat of years of constant burning. But all of them whispered, their voices joining in a chorus of the damned that rose from every corner of the crater. Maeve led her squad between the flames, her blessed rosary glowing softly in response to the unholy presence that surrounded them. The ground beneath their feet was not soil but ash, the compressed remains of everything that had been destroyed in the bombardment. With each step, small puffs of gray dust rose around their boots, carrying with it the taste of burned wood, melted metal, and something else that none of them wanted to identify. "Stay close," Maeve whispered, her voice barely audible over the constant murmur of the flames. "Do not touch any of the candles yet. We need to understand the pattern before we begin." The squad moved in formation, their weapons ready but not yet raised. Around them, the green flames danced and swayed as if responding to their presence. The whispers grew louder as they passed, individual voices becoming distinct from the greater chorus. Some spoke in Latin, others in Greek or Arabic or languages that predated the coming of the true faith. All carried the same tone of desperate pleading, souls begging for release from their eternal torment. Brother Khalil paused beside a flame that burned from what appeared to be a child's spine, the vertebrae no larger than coins. The whispers that rose from it were high and plaintive, speaking words in a dialect he recognized from his youth in the desert monasteries. "She is saying her prayers," he murmured, his scarred face twisted with grief. Over and over, the same prayer her mother taught her. Maeve placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will free her, brother. We will free them all." They continued deeper into the first terrace, navigating between market stalls that had been transformed into altars of bone and ash. The green flames seemed to track their movement, turning to follow them like flowers following the sun. In the distance, at the center of the crater, a larger flame burned with the intensity of a beacon, its light visible even through the forest of lesser candles that surrounded it. Sister Helena knelt beside one of the flames, studying the spinal cord that served as its wick. Her medical training allowed her to see details that the others missed, and what she observed made her blood run cold. "These aren't just the spines of the dead," she whispered, her voice tight with horror. "The nerve tissue is still alive, still sending signals. Somewhere in this crater there are bodies still clinging to life, feeling every moment of their burning." The implications of her words settled over the squad like a shroud. They were not simply looking at the remains of the dead, but at the ongoing torment of the living, souls trapped in a state between life and death, their suffering feeding the power of the unholy flames. Maeve made the decision they all knew was inevitable. "We begin here," she said, approaching the nearest flame. "Brother Pavel, be ready with covering fire. The moment I extinguish this candle, our true enemy will reveal itself." She drew her ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming with reflected green light. The weapon had been blessed in the sacred oils of 7 different monasteries, and its edge was sharp enough to cut through both flesh and spirit. Taking a deep breath, She reached toward the flame that burned from a soldier's spine, still clad in the tattered remnants of an iron sultanate uniform. The moment her blade severed the spinal cord, three things happened simultaneously. The green flame guttered and died, releasing a soul's worth of anguish in a single piercing wail. The darkness where the candle had burned began to writhe and coalesce, taking on familiar contours, and from every other flame in the crater came a chorus of screams as the trapped souls recognized that their liberation had begun. The shadow that rose from the extinguished candle was an exact duplicate of Maeve herself, down to the scars on her face and the blessed rosary around her neck. But where the real Maeve's eyes held compassion and determination, the shadows held only malice and hunger. It spoke with her voice, moved with her grace, and when it drew its own blade, the weapon gleamed with the same unholy light as the flames around them. "You think to play savior," the Shadow Maeve hissed, circling the real chaplain like a predator stalking its prey, "but you are nothing more than another soul to feed the fire. Your righteousness is just another form of pride, and pride is the first sin." The real Maeve raised her blade in response, settling into a fighting stance she had learned in the monastery combat yards decades before. "I am what the faithful have made me," she replied calmly, "and the faithful do not abandon their own to torment." The two figures clashed in the green-lit darkness, blessed steel ringing against shadow-forged metal. Around them, the squad watched in fascination and horror as their leader battled her own reflection, each move mirrored by the other until it was impossible to tell which was the original and which was the copy. Brother Khalil raised his rifle, seeking a clear shot, but hesitated. In the shifting light of the flames, both figures looked equally real, equally determined. How could he fire without risking the life of his chaplain? The battle raged for long minutes, neither combatant gaining a clear advantage. The Shadow Maeve fought with all the skill and knowledge of the original, but it lacked one crucial element, the faith that had sustained the real chaplain through 7 years of war. That faith proved decisive when Shadow Maeve overextended herself in a killing thrust, allowing the real chaplain to slip inside her guard and drive her blade deep into the duplicate's chest. The shadow screamed as it dissolved back into darkness, its death throes echoing across the crater like the wail of a banshee. But its destruction brought no sense of victory to the watching squad, only the grim knowledge that they had just witnessed a preview of what awaited them all. One flame extinguished, Maeve panted, wiping her blade clean on a scrap of cloth. 10,000 more to go, but even as she spoke, new shadows were rising from the darkness around them. Other flames had been guttering and dying on their own, victims of some unseen wind or disturbance, and each death had spawned its own duplicate. The squad found themselves surrounded by a growing army of their own reflections, shadow warriors armed with weapons identical to their own. The battle for the first terrace began in earnest as blessed steel met shadow-forged metal in a clash that rang across the crater like thunder. Brother Pavel's machine gun chattered to life, its blessed bullets tearing through shadow flesh with devastating effect. But for every duplicate he destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. Sister Agatha danced between her enemies with deadly grace, her blessed blade leaving trails of silver light as it carved through the ranks of the shadow army. But it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. For every candle they extinguished, a new duplicate joined the enemy ranks. For every shadow they destroyed, another flame died somewhere in the darkness, spawning fresh horrors to harry their flanks. "We cannot fight them all," Brother Khalil shouted over the din of battle, his rifle cracking as he picked off shadows that tried to flank Sister Helena. "There are too many." Maeve nodded grimly, her own blade weaving patterns of destruction through the press of duplicates around her. "Then we don't fight them all, we run." The retreat from the first terrace was a running battle through streets of ash and bone, the squad leapfrogging from cover to cover as the shadows pressed their attack. Behind them, the extinguished flames left pools of absolute darkness that seemed to follow their movement, creeping across the ground like spilled ink. As they reached the slope leading to the second terrace, Maeve called a halt. They had lost no one, but their ammunition was running low, and the psychological toll of fighting their own reflections was beginning to show on every face. "The shadows cannot follow us into the deeper levels," she said, though she was not entirely certain of this claim. "Each terrace seems to have its own rules, its own guardians. We push forward, extinguishing flames only when necessary, and trust that our path will become clearer as we near the center." The second terrace had once been the residential quarter of Cathara, its modest homes and family shrines now reduced to foundations and broken walls. Here the candles burned from the spines of civilians, women and children whose only crime had been living in the path of the Iron Sultanate's advancing artillery. Their whispers were softer than those of the soldiers, prayers and lullabies mixed with gentle sobbing that broke the hearts of the listening warriors. But the shadows that guarded this level were different as well. Instead of aggressive duplicates, they encountered phantoms of memory, ghostly figures that reenacted the final moments of the bombardment over and over again. A mother clutching her infant as shells fell around them, a father trying to shield his family with nothing but his own body, children running through streets that erupted in flames and shrapnel. These phantoms paid no attention to the living intruders, lost as they were in their endless loop of tragedy. But their presence made movement through the terrace a psychological ordeal, forcing the squad to witness the human cost of the war that had raged for 8 centuries since the Hell Gate of Jerusalem first opened. Sister Helena wept openly as they passed a phantom of a young girl, no more than 10 years old, who knelt beside the crater-torn body of her doll, trying desperately to stuff its cotton innards back inside its torn fabric skin. The image repeated endlessly, the phantom child never succeeding in her task, never giving up hope that her toy could be made whole again. "How many more?" Brother Marcus whispered, his usual stoicism cracked by the weight of observed suffering. "How many more innocents have died in this cursed war?" None of them had an answer. The war had been raging for so long that no one alive remembered its beginning. Only the endless cycle of attack and counterattack, of ground gained and lost again, of trenches carved from mud and corpses that shifted with each season's campaign. They pressed on through the residential terrace, extinguishing candles only when their path was blocked, each death spawning its own shadow duplicate but fewer in number than before. The rules were indeed different here, as if the civilian dead were less aggressive in their corruption, more concerned with their endless reenactments of trauma than with hunting the living. By the time they reached the third terrace, dawn was breaking over the crater's rim. The green light of the candles seemed to dim in the growing daylight, and the whispers of the trapped souls grew fainter. But instead of bringing relief, the daylight revealed new horrors that had been hidden in the darkness. The third terrace contained the ruins of Cathara's Cathedral district, where a dozen different churches had served the spiritual needs of the town's diverse population. The bombardment had reduced most of these sacred buildings to rubble, but their foundations remained, carved deep into the living rock of the crater wall. And from these foundations grew the largest candles they had yet encountered, flames that burned from spinal cords the size of tree trunks. "Bishops," Maeve whispered, recognizing the ceremonial scarification that marked the vertebrae of the church hierarchy. "The entire ecclesiastical leadership of Cathara burns here." The implications were staggering. These were not just any souls trapped in the flames, but the consecrated servants of the faith, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the service of the divine. Their corruption was a blasphemy beyond measure, their torment a wound in the fabric of creation itself. But worse than the sight of the burning bishops was what surrounded them. The shadows cast by these massive flames were not duplicates of the squad members, but shadow versions of the bishops themselves, towering figures in phantom vestments who preached sermons of despair and corruption to congregations of lesser shadows. "Abandon your mission," boomed the shadow of what had once been Archbishop Cyrus, his voice echoing across the terrace like thunder. "Join us in the flame, and know the peace of surrender. The war cannot be won. The faithful cannot be saved. All paths lead to ash and bone and the green fire that burns forever." The Shadow Bishop's words carried a weight of authority that made the squad members' knees buckle. These were not just duplicates, but corrupted versions of men who had once wielded genuine spiritual power. Their sermons of despair struck at the very foundation of faith that sustained the warriors, threatening to break their spirits before the battle could even be joined. Maeve raised her blessed rosary, its bone beads glowing brighter than ever in response to the spiritual assault. "You are not the men you pretend to be," she shouted back, her voice carrying across the terrace. "You are nothing but shadows and lies, the whispers of doubt that every faithful soul must face." The Shadow Archbishop laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I am Archbishop Cyrus of Cathara, consecrated in the sacred oils, ordained by the laying on of hands that stretches back to the apostles themselves. And I tell you, child, that your mission is doomed. The candles cannot be extinguished, for they burn with the power of truth itself. The truth that all faith is illusion, all hope is delusion, and all roads lead to the pit." Around him, the other shadow bishops took up the refrain, their voices joining in a harmony of despair that seemed to suck the very light from the morning sky. The squad found themselves slowing, their weapons growing heavy in their hands, their resolve wavering in the face of such authoritative despair. It was Brother Pavel who broke the spell, his machine gun roaring to life as he opened fire on the shadow congregation. His blessed bullets tore through the phantom bishops like paper, disrupting their sermon and giving the others time to recover their equilibrium. "They're not real," he shouted over the gunfire. "Just shadows pretending to authority they no longer possess. The real bishops died in the bombardment. These are just echoes, trying to drag us down with them." The battle for the Cathedral terrace was the most challenging yet, not because of physical opposition, but because of the spiritual assault mounted by the shadow bishops. Each one preached a different sermon of despair, attacking the individual doubts and fears of the squad members. They spoke of the futility of war, the corruption of the church hierarchy, the abandonment of the faithful by their supposed saviors. But Maeve and her warriors pressed on, extinguishing the massive candles one by one despite the cost. Each death of a bishop's flame spawned not just shadow duplicates of the squad, but entire congregations of phantom worshippers, shadow armies that had to be fought through street by ruined street. By the time they reached the fourth terrace, the squad had been reduced by attrition, if not by death. Brother Marcus had become lost somewhere in the battle against a particularly aggressive shadow congregation, either killed or transformed into one of the duplicates that now hunted them. Sister Agatha bore wounds that refused to heal properly, spiritual injuries inflicted by shadow weapons that cut at the soul as well as the flesh. The fourth terrace contained what had once been Cathara's military district, where the local garrison had made their headquarters and trained the town's militia. The candles here burned from the spines of soldiers, but these were different from those they had encountered on the first terrace. These men had died fighting, their spinal cords twisted into spirals of rage and defiance that burned with a fierce green fire. The shadows cast by these flames were not duplicates or preachers of despair, but memories of battles that had never been fought. Phantom armies clashed in the ruins, reenacting campaigns from the 800-year war, but with outcomes that differed from recorded history. Here the Iron Sultanate had won at the Battle of the Bleeding Ossuary. There the heretic legions had successfully stormed the walls of New Antioch. Every defeat of the faithful was played out in endless repetition, every victory transformed into disaster. "This is what we're fighting," Maeve realized as she watched a phantom version of herself being torn apart by shadow heretics. Not just the shadows of what was, but the shadows of what could have been. All the possible defeats, all the potential betrayals. The psychological impact was devastating. To see oneself fail, over and over again, in every possible permutation of disaster, was to confront the essential fragility of faith itself. How many times had victory been snatched from the jaws of defeat by nothing more than chance or providence? How many times had heroism been revealed as futility, sacrifice as waste? But there was no time for philosophical contemplation. The phantom armies had noticed the intruders. and now they turned their attention from their eternal battles to the very real threat of the living. Waves of shadow soldiers crashed against the squad's defensive positions, their weapons carrying the weight of all the conflicts that had never been resolved. The retreat from the fourth terrace was a rout, the squad barely staying ahead of the phantom armies as they fought their way down toward the fifth level. Behind them, the sounds of eternal battle grew louder, as if their presence had somehow energized the ancient conflicts that played out in the shadows. By the time they reached the fifth terrace, only 7 members of the original squad remained. Brother Khalil had fallen during the retreat, overwhelmed by a wave of shadow cavalry that had ridden him down despite his blessed ammunition. Sister Helena had become separated from the group during a running battle through the ruins of an armory, her fate unknown but certainly grim. The fifth terrace had once been the industrial heart of Cathara, where smiths and craftsmen had worked to supply both the town's needs and the war effort beyond its borders. The bombardment had twisted metal and stone into impossible shapes, creating a landscape of fused machinery and molten architecture that defied rational understanding. Here the candles burned from the spines of workers, men and women whose hands had been stained with honest labor before the shells began to fall. But their flames were different again, burning with a cold light that seemed to leach warmth from the surrounding air. The shadows cast by these flames were not duplicates or phantoms, but absences, holes in reality where light and hope simply ceased to exist. Walking through the industrial terrace was like navigating a maze of despair made manifest. The absent shadows followed the squad like hungry voids, draining color and meaning from everything they touched. Weapons became heavier, armor more burdensome, faith itself more difficult to maintain in the face of such absolute negation. "We're running out of time," Sister Agatha whispered, her wounded form barely able to keep pace with the others. "The sun is climbing, and with each hour that passes, the shadows grow stronger." Maeve nodded grimly. They had been descending through the crater for nearly 8 hours, and the master candle at its center still burned with undiminished intensity. At their current rate of progress, they would reach the 6th terrace by midday, but the final assault on the crater's heart would not come until well into the afternoon. And with each level they descended, the opposition grew more sophisticated, more targeted in its assault on their resolve. The shadows were learning, adapting, becoming more effective at exploiting the psychological weaknesses of their opponents. The 6th terrace proved this point with devastating clarity. What had once been Cathara's seat of government, its city hall and administrative buildings, now hosted candles that burned from the spines of bureaucrats and civil servants. But these flames cast shadows that were not absent voids or phantom armies, but perfect simulations of the squad members' own memories. Shadow Maeve knelt beside the deathbed of her mentor, the old exorcist who had taught her the prayers of binding and the techniques of spiritual warfare. But in this shadow memory, the dying woman's final words were not blessings but curses, accusations that Maeve had failed in her duties, that every soul she had claimed to save had been lost to damnation. Shadow Pavel stood before a field hospital, watching helplessly as his machine gun jammed during a critical battle, allowing heretic forces to overrun the position and slaughter wounded soldiers who had trusted him to protect them. The memory repeated endlessly, each iteration showing him new ways he could have prevented the disaster, new moments where better judgment might have saved lives. Each member of the remaining squad was forced to confront their deepest failures, their most shameful moments, played out in shadow form with perfect accuracy. The psychological assault was more devastating than any physical attack, striking at the very core of their identity as servants of the faithful. But it was in facing these shadow memories that Maeve finally understood the true nature of their enemy. The crater was not just a prison for the souls of the dead, but a mirror for the souls of the living, reflecting back their doubts and fears and failures with perfect clarity. The master candle at its center did not just burn with the power of the trapped dead, but with the accumulated guilt and despair of every soul who had ever looked upon the crater and recognized their own failures reflected in its depths. "We are not fighting shadows," she realized, speaking the words aloud so that her surviving companions could hear them. We are fighting ourselves. Our own doubts, our own fears, our own failures made manifest. The crater feeds on despair, grows stronger with every moment of self-doubt. The revelation came almost too late. Around them, the shadow memories were growing more solid, more real, threatening to drag them into an endless loop of relived failure and regret. But understanding the enemy's nature also revealed its weakness. "Remember your victories," Maeve commanded, raising her blessed rosary so that its light pushed back the encroaching shadows. "Remember every soul you have saved, every demon you have banished, every moment when faith proved stronger than fear. The shadows can only show you failure because that is all they know. They cannot comprehend triumph, cannot understand redemption." One by one, the shadow memories began to flicker and fade as the squad members focused on their successes rather than their failures. Brother Pavel remembered the hospital he had defended, not the one he had failed to save. Sister Agatha recalled the demons she had banished, not the ones that had escaped her blade. Each positive memory struck at the shadows like a physical blow, disrupting their hold on reality. The battle for the 6th terrace became a battle of memories, past victories against past failures, hope against despair. And slowly, gradually, the forces of faith began to prevail. The shadow memories retreated into the darkness from which they had emerged, their power broken by the simple act of remembering that failure was not the only truth. As they began their descent toward the 7th and final terrace before the crater's center, Maeve felt a change in the air around them. The green light of the candles was growing brighter, more intense, as they approached the source of the crater's power. The whispers of the trapped souls were becoming a roar, a chorus of agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But there was something else as well, something that filled her with both hope and terror in equal measure. She could feel the presence of the master candle, the nexus from which all the other flames drew their power. It was close now, perhaps only an hour's march through the final terrace, and with that proximity came the knowledge of what would be required to extinguish it. The master candle burned not from a single spinal cord, but from her own. Somewhere in the crater's depths, a shadow version of herself tended the greatest flame of all, feeding it with her own life force, her own spiritual essence. To extinguish the master candle, she would have to confront this ultimate shadow self and surrender her own life to break the cycle of eternal burning. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have sent her fleeing back toward the crater's rim. Instead, it filled her with a sense of completion, of purpose finally understood. She had spent 7 years fighting the shadows of war, 7 years trying to save souls from damnation. Now she had the chance to save not just the souls trapped in the crater, but every soul that would otherwise be drawn into its web of despair. The 7th terrace stretched before them like a garden of the damned, its carefully planned streets and elegant buildings reduced to a maze of twisted metal and burning bone. Here were the candles of Cathara's wealthy and powerful. Merchants and nobles whose spines had been fused with gold and silver during the bombardment, creating flames that burned with unnatural colors and cast shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intelligence. But the squad barely noticed these final guardians, their attention focused entirely on the massive flame that burned at the crater's absolute center. The master candle rose like a pillar of green fire, its light visible from every point in the crater, its heat felt even at this distance. And beside it, tending its flame with devotional care, stood a figure that made Maeve's blood run cold with recognition. The shadow Maeve that guarded the master candle was not like the crude duplicate that had been spawned by the first extinguished flame. This version was perfected, refined by hours of feeding on the crater's power. She wore robes of deeper black than any earthly fabric, and her face held an expression of serene certainty that the real Maeve had never possessed. When she looked up from her vigil, her eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed to stretch back through centuries of accumulated wisdom. "I have been waiting," the shadow Maeve said, her voice carrying across the crater's center with unnatural clarity. Since the moment you first knelt at the crater's rim, I knew you would come. I felt your determination, your naive belief that sacrifice could somehow purify this place. The surviving members of Maeve's squad, now reduced to herself, Sister Agatha and Brother Pavel, approached the master candle with weapons drawn, but even blessed steel felt inadequate in the face of what they confronted. The master candle was not merely a flame burning from a spinal cord, but a fusion of bone and fire that defied comprehension. Hundreds of vertebrae had been melted and reformed into a spiral tower 20 feet tall, each segment pulsing with its own rhythm of life and death. The green flame that crowned it was not fire at all, but pure spiritual energy given visible form. You understand now, the Shadow Maeve continued, circling the master candle with reverent steps. This is not an abomination to be destroyed, but a miracle to be preserved. Every soul that burns here is freed from the burden of uncertainty, the agony of hope. They know their fate, accept their torment, and in that acceptance find a kind of peace. Brother Pavel raised his machine gun, but his hands shook as he sighted down the barrel. "You're not Chaplain Maeve," he said, his voice cracking with strain. "You're just another shadow, another lie." The Shadow Chaplain smiled, an expression of such perfect compassion that it was more terrifying than any snarl of rage. "I am what she could become, what she will become, if she simply stops fighting the inevitable. Look around you, Pavel. Look at what your crusade has accomplished." For the first time since entering the crater, Maeve allowed herself to truly see the scope of their journey. Behind them, the 7 terraces rose in a spiral toward the rim, and on every level the shadows they had created moved in endless patterns of corruption. Shadow duplicates of herself and her fallen comrades walked among the candles, tending them with the same devotional care as the perfected shadow at the crater's heart. Every flame they had extinguished during their descent had been rekindled by the shadows, fed now not just by the spinal cords of the original victims but by fragments of the squad's own spiritual essence. Their mission of liberation had become an act of multiplication, spreading their own corruption across every level of the crater city. "You see it now," the Shadow Maeve said, her voice filled with gentle pity. "Every step you have taken has made the problem worse. Every shadow you have created is a new guardian for the flames, a new servant of the eternal burning. You came here to save souls, but you have only damned more." Sister Agatha fell to her knees, her blessed blade clattering on the stone floor of the crater's center. The psychological weight of their failure pressed down upon her like a physical force, crushing the faith that had sustained her through 7 years of war. Around her, new candles were beginning to sprout from the ground, fed by her despair, their wicks formed from invisible threads of her own spiritual essence. But Maeve herself did not break. She had foreseen this moment, had understood from the beginning that her mission might require the ultimate sacrifice. Drawing her ceremonial dagger, she advanced toward the shadow version of herself, her eyes fixed not on her duplicate's face but on the master candle that burned behind her. "You're right," she said, her voice steady despite the horror that surrounded them. "Every choice I've made has multiplied the suffering here. Every soul I've tried to save has been bound more tightly to their torment. But there is one choice left to make." The Shadow Maeve's expression shifted from compassion to alarm as she realized what her original intended. "No," she whispered, stepping back toward the master candle. "If you destroy yourself here, if you sever your own connection to life, the feedback will shatter every candle in the crater. 10,000 souls will be cast into the void, not freed but annihilated utterly." "Perhaps," Maeve replied, raising her dagger toward her own throat. "Or perhaps that annihilation is the only mercy left to offer them." The shadow lunged forward, her own blade manifesting from darkness to block the strike. The 2 versions of the same soul clashed beside the master candle, their battle casting wild shadows across the crater's walls. But this was not a fight between equals. The Shadow Mave drew her power from the crater itself, from the accumulated despair of 10,000 trapped souls. With each passing moment, she grew stronger, while the real Mave felt her strength ebbing away. Brother Pavel opened fire, his blessed bullets tearing through the air toward the shadow combatants. But in the shifting light of the master candle, he could no longer tell which figure was his chaplain and which was the corruption that wore her face. His shots went wild, striking the stone walls and sending fragments of ancient bones scattering across the crater floor. The battle raged for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes. Slowly, inevitably, the Shadow Mave gained the upper hand. Her blade found openings in the real chaplain's defense, carved wounds that leaked not blood but light itself. Each injury weakened Mave further. Each drop of spiritual essence that spilled fed the master candle and made her duplicate stronger. As she felt her strength failing, Mave made a final, desperate gambit. Instead of trying to kill her shadow self, she allowed the duplicate's blade to pierce her heart, using the moment of the shadow's triumph to drive her own dagger deep into the base of the master candle. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The fusion of bone and fire that had served as the crater's nexus began to crack and split, its carefully maintained structure failing as Mave's life force was added to the conflicting energies within. The green flames that had burned for 3 years began to flicker and dim, their light failing as the spiritual matrix that sustained them collapsed. But the Shadow Mave had been right about one thing. The destruction of the master candle did not free the trapped souls, but annihilated them entirely. 10,000 voices rose in a final chorus of agony before being cut off mid-scream, their essence scattered to the winds like ash from a funeral pyre. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound they had heard in the crater's depths. The shockwave from the candle's destruction rippled outward through all 7 terraces, extinguishing every flame and destroying every shadow in a spanning wave of absolute darkness. Brother Pavel and Sister Agatha found themselves alone in a crater that had become a tomb, surrounded by the burned-out remnants of candles that would never again carry the whispers of the damned. But their victory, such as it was, came with a price that made their success indistinguishable from failure. Maeve's body lay beside the shattered remains of the master candle, her life extinguished along with the flames she had sought to quench. Her shadow self had vanished with the destruction of the crater's power, leaving only the empty shell of the woman who had led them into the depths. As dawn broke over the crater's rim, the 2 survivors began their long climb back to the surface. But with each step they took, they could feel new shadows stirring in the darkness behind them. The crater's power had been broken, but not destroyed, and already it was beginning to regenerate, to rebuild itself from the spiritual residue left by their passage. By the time they reached the first terrace, new candles were beginning to sprout from the ground. Their wicks formed from fragments of bone and memory that had survived the destruction. These flames burned with a different color than the original green fire, a deep purple light that seemed to pull warmth and hope from the very air around them. Sister Agatha looked back toward the crater's center, where a single candle had already begun to burn with familiar intensity. The wick was unmistakably formed from Maeve's spinal cord, twisted into the same spiral pattern as all the others, and the flame that crowned it whispered prayers in the chaplain's own voice. "We have to go back," she said, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. "We have to finish what she started." But Brother Pavel was already walking toward the crater's rim, his machine gun discarded somewhere in the depths below. "No," he said without looking back. "We leave. We report what we found here, and we pray that someone with more wisdom than we possess can find a better solution." Behind them, the purple flames continued to multiply, fed by the spiritual residue of their failed mission. The crater had survived their assault, adapted to their tactics, learned from their sacrifice. And in the growing light of the purple fire, new shadows began to move, shadows that bore the faces of the living as well as the dead. The whispers that rose from the rekindled flames spoke not in languages of the past, but in the accents and dialects of the present war. Soldiers who still fought in distant trenches suddenly found their voices added to the crater's chorus. Their life force slowly drained away to feed flames that burned in a place they had never seen. As Sister Agatha and Brother Pavel climbed the final slope toward the crater's rim, they could hear their own voices joining the whispers, feel their own spiritual essence being pulled back toward the purple flames. The crater had marked them during their passage through its depths, claimed them as surely as it had claimed every other soul that had looked upon its horror. They would return to their units, file their reports, continue their service in the endless war. But part of them would always remain in the crater, feeding the flames with their memories, their fears, their slowly diminishing hope. And when their bodies finally failed them on some distant battlefield, their spinal cords would find their way back to Cathara to burn as wicks in candles that could never be extinguished. The crater waited, patient as only the truly eternal could be patient. It had learned from its encounter with the faithful, evolved beyond their ability to comprehend or combat. And in the purple light of its new flames, it began to dream of expansion, of carrying its gift of certain despair beyond the confines of its 7 terraces to touch every corner of the war-torn world. The whispers continued, growing stronger with each passing hour, calling out to every soul that carried the weight of failure or doubt or loss. In distant trenches, soldiers paused in their duties as they heard familiar voices speaking their names. In monastery cells, monks interrupted their prayers as they recognized the voices of old friends among the crater's chorus. Across the battlefields of the endless war, the living began to hear the call of the purple flames, and one by one they began to answer. The crater had become something new, something that transcended its original purpose as a prison for the dead. It was now a beacon for the living, a promise that all suffering could end in the certainty of eternal torment, that all doubt could be resolved in the acceptance of damnation. And at its heart, where the master candle had once burned green with the power of the trapped dead, a new flame now burned purple with the power of the converted living. Its wick was formed from Maeve's spinal cord, but the voice that whispered from its fire spoke with the authority of newfound revelation. "Come," the purple flame whispered, its words carrying across continents to touch the ears of every faithful soul who had ever questioned their purpose. "Come and know peace in certainty, comfort in despair, rest in eternal burning. The war will never end, but your part in it can cease. Come to Cathara and let your doubts be transformed into truth." The invitation spread like plague across the war-torn world, carried not by wind or messenger but by the spiritual connections that bound all faithful souls together. And in distant places, in monastery cells and trench chaplains' quarters, in field hospitals and command bunkers, holy men and women began to pack their belongings for a pilgrimage to the crater city of the damned.